In a city shrouded in shadows, where power and greed run unchecked, one woman's ambition has turned deadly. The fall of Victoria Kane takes you deep into a web of secrets, betrayal, and impossible choices. When a streetwise girl uncovers the truth about a billionaire's dark empire, she ignites a dangerous chain of events that threatens everything and everyone in its path. But can courage and resilience stand against a force that seems unstoppable? The clock is ticking, and every decision brings them closer to either justice or ruin. Prepare for a story of survival, sacrifice, and the fight for truth in a world where trust can be the deadliest weapon. Stay with us, because the answers will shock you. The streets of Los Angeles came alive as the sun dipped below the horizon. Bright neon lights illuminated the sidewalks, where hurried pedestrians bustled past each other, their minds fixed on the night ahead. The chaotic hum of honking cars and distant laughter echoed through the air, masking the quieter corners of the city. In one of these forgotten corners stood Ellie, a 13-year-old girl with tangled hair and tattered clothes. Her thin arms clutched a small cardboard box, her makeshift home. Her brown eyes scanned the crowd as she called out in a hoarse voice, "Spare some change? Please, anything helps. I haven't eaten in 2 days." Most people ignored her, averting their gaze. A man in a tailored suit walked by without breaking stride, the shiny leather of his shoes catching Ellie's eye. He didn't even glance at her. Ellie sighed, leaning against the brick wall of a restaurant she knew well. The Golden Hour, a place for the city's elite. Through the fog glass, she could see waiters in crisp uniforms weaving between tables, carrying dishes that gleamed under chandeliers. The savory scent of grilled steak and garlic bread teased her empty stomach. Her gaze drifted to a large table near the center of the dining room, where Robert King, a well-known real estate tycoon, sat. He was a tall man in his late 40s with sharp features and an air of authority. Across from him sat his wife, Victoria, a striking woman with flawless makeup and an icy smile. Her diamond necklace sparkled under the soft light, but her cold demeanor hinted at something darker. Ellie watched as Victoria rose from the table, clutching her designer handbag. She strode purposefully toward the kitchen, her stiletto heels clicking against the marble floor. Intrigued, Ellie crept closer to the restaurant's side window, where a narrow view of the kitchen revealed a flurry of activity. Hidden in the shadows, Ellie watched Victoria reach into her handbag and pull out a small, dark vial. The liquid inside shimmered ominously under the fluorescent lights. Victoria glanced around, ensuring no one was looking, and tipped the vial's contents onto the dish meant for Robert. With a swift motion, she placed the empty vial back in her bag and adjusted her lipstick as if nothing had happened. Ellie's heart pounded. "She's poisoning him," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging up the glass. Her mind raced. She couldn't let this happen, but who would believe her? She was just a homeless girl, invisible to the world. Gathering every ounce of courage, Ellie burst through the restaurant's side entrance. The diners turned to look, their faces a mix of shock and disgust as they took in her ragged appearance. "Don't eat that," Ellie shouted, her voice cracking. She pointed directly at Robert, who was raising his fork. "She put poison in your food. Don't eat it." A hush fell over the room. Victoria gasped, placing a hand on her chest in mock outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with practiced indignation. Robert froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked between Ellie and Victoria. "What is she talking about, Victoria?" he asked, his tone sharp. I don't know," Victoria stammered, tears welling in her eyes. She must be trying to scam us or cause a scene. A security guard grabbed Ellie by the arm, his grip firm. "You need to leave, kid. You can't just barge in here like this." "No," Ellie cried, struggling against him. "I saw her. She put something in your food. Please, you have to believe me." Robert hesitated, his brow furrowed. He set the fork down and looked at Victoria, who avoided his gaze. A faint doubt flickered in his eyes. Suddenly, His chest tightened and a wave of dizziness washed over him. He clutched the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. The room spun as gas erupted from the other diners. "Robert!" Victoria exclaimed, rushing to his side. But her concern looked more calculated than genuine. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. The guard released Ellie to help Robert, but she stayed rooted in place, her fists clenched. "I told you," she murmured. "I tried to warn you." Within minutes, paramedics arrived, pushing past the stunned onlookers to reach Robert. As they carried him out on a stretcher, Victoria followed closely, her crocodile tears on full display. Ellie watched from the shadows as the flashing ambulance lights faded into the distance. Her stomach churned, not from hunger, but from frustration. She knew the truth, but she also knew no one would believe her. In the hospital, Robert lies unconscious in a sterile room, his face pale. A doctor speaks to Victoria, who nods solemnly, but the camera lingers on her expression as the doctor walks away. Her grief evaporates, replaced by a subtle smirk. Meanwhile, Ellie sits on the curb outside the golden hour, hugging her knees. The faint echo of sirens fades into the night. She looks up at the city lights, her eyes filled with determination. "If no one believes me, I'll find a way to prove it myself," she whispers, setting the stage for the storm yet to come. The night air outside the golden hour was brisk, carrying a faint chill that crept through the bustling streets of Los Angeles. While life in the city moved on, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded inside the restaurant, Ellie sat on the edge of the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her thoughts raced, replaying the moment she had seen Victoria pour the poison into Robert's plate. "I tried," she muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't they believe me?" The distant wail of ambulance sirens broke through her thoughts. She could still see Robert's face, pale and contorted in pain as he was carried out of the restaurant. She hadn't wanted to cause a scene. She only wanted to help. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the hunger that had driven her to the restaurant in the first place. But food was the last thing on her mind now. She needed to know if Robert would survive. Meanwhile, at the hospital, inside the private wing of St. Mary's Medical Center, Robert King lay unconscious in a stark white room. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the air as doctors worked to stabilize his condition. His breathing was shallow, and his usually commanding presence had faded into frailty. Standing by his bedside was Victoria, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically against her phone. A nurse approached cautiously. "Mrs. King, your husband's condition is stable for now, but the tests indicate he ingested a toxic substance. We're running additional tests to confirm." Victoria's face contorted into an expression of manufactured grief. "Toxic substance? How could that happen?" she asked, her voice trembling with feigned innocence. "We're not sure yet," the nurse replied, but the quick response likely saved his life. "We've administered an antidote and his vital signs are improving." As soon as the nurse left, Victoria's crocodile tears vanished. She looked down at Robert's unconscious form and leaned closer. "You always were too trusting," she whispered coldly. "But don't worry, this will all be over soon." Ellie's interrogation. While Robert fought for his life, Ellie found herself thrust into a different kind of battle. The harsh fluorescent lights of a small police interrogation room bore down on her. Her hands were cuffed to the metal table, and a stern officer loomed over her. "All right, kid," said Detective Daniels, a burly man with a deep voice and a skeptical glare. "Start talking. What were you doing in that restaurant?" Ellie's fists clenched against the table. "I told you already. I saw her put something in his food. She poisoned him." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his disbelief apparent. "And why would the wife of one of the richest men in LA do something like that? What's your angle here? Trying to scam him? Blackmail?" "No," Ellie snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "I don't want anything from him. I was just looking for food, and I saw her do it." She had a little bottle, and she poured it onto his plate. "I swear," Daniels leaned back, crossing his arms. So, you're telling me you were trespassing, looking for scraps, and just so happened to witness a murder attempt? Do you know how that sounds? Ellie bit her lip, tears threatening to spill. She knew the odds were stacked against her. She was just a homeless girl. No one would take her word over someone like Victoria King. The door opened and another officer stepped in, nodding to Daniels. "We just got word from the hospital. King is stable, but they confirmed it. Poison. Labs still working on identifying the substance." Daniels turned back to Ellie, his expression softening slightly. "Looks like you were right about the poison, but that doesn't mean you didn't have something to do with it. Why don't you tell me the real story, huh? Who put you up to this?" Ellie's heart sank. No matter what she said, they wouldn't believe her. Victoria's plan deepens. Back at the hospital, Victoria met with her lawyer, Lawrence Carter, a shrewd man in an expensive suit. They spoke in hushed tones in a corner of the hospital lobby. "We have a problem," Victoria began, her voice low but firm. "That girl at the restaurant, she saw me." Lawrence frowned. "The street kid? She doesn't have any credibility. No one will believe her over you." "Maybe not," Victoria replied, "but she's already caused enough trouble. The police are questioning her. If she keeps talking, it could complicate things." Lawrence nodded slowly, his calculating gaze meeting hers. "Leave it to me. I'll make sure she's handled. Focus on Robert for now. Play the grieving wife. The more sympathy you get, the less likely anyone will question you." Victoria smirked, adjusting her designer coat. "I knew I could count on you." Ellie's release. Hours later, Ellie was escorted out of the interrogation room. Her cuffs removed, but her spirit crushed. The police had no evidence to hold her, but the distrust in their eyes was clear. As she stepped outside the precinct, the night felt colder than before. She wrapped her arms around herself, aimlessly wandering the streets. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, and helplessness. She had tried to do the right thing, and it had only made things worse. "No one's going to believe me," she whispered. "Not unless I find proof." Determined, Ellie made her way back to the golden hour, avoiding the glaring lights of the front entrance. She slipped into the alley behind the restaurant, her eyes scanning for anything that might help her case. Inside the hospital, Robert stirred in his hospital bed, his eyelids fluttering open for the first time since the poisoning. His vision was blurry, but one image stood out in his mind, a faint memory of a girl's voice yelling, "Don't eat that." He muttered weakly, "The girl, she tried to save me." The camera cuts to Ellie, crouched behind the restaurant's dumpsters, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic, the discarded vial Victoria had used. Her eyes widened as she picked it up, hope flickering in her chest. But from the shadows, an imposing figure emerged. Lawrence Carter, sent by Victoria to tie up loose ends. "Looking for something, kid?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. Ellie froze, clutching the vial tightly as the screen fades to black. The cold metal of the vial pressed against Ellie's palm as she clutched it tightly, her breath shallow in the dimly lit alley behind the golden hour. Her heart raced as she faced the shadowy figure of Lawrence Carter, Victoria King's lawyer. His sharp suit and polished demeanor barely masked the predatory intent in his eyes. "You've been a very busy little girl," Lawrence said, his tone unervingly calm. "But it's time to stop playing hero. Hand it over." Ellie took a step back, her mind racing. The vial she'd found was the only proof she had. Without it, her claims would remain just that, words no one believed. "I'm not giving it to you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Lawrence's smile didn't falter as he stepped forward. "Do you think anyone will believe you? A street rat with no name, no address, no family? The police barely took you seriously." Ellie's chest tightened. She knew he was right. Her word against someone like Victoria's was worthless. But she also knew what she'd seen. "You can't scare me," she lied, her grip on the vial tightening. Lawrence's expression hardened. "I don't need to scare you. I just need to take that evidence. Before Ellie could react, he lunged. She turned and bolted, her bare feet pounding against the pavement. A desperate escape. Ellie weaved through the narrow alleyways, the echo of Lawrence's footsteps close behind. The weight of the vial in her pocket reminded her of its importance, fueling her determination to escape. "You're only making this harder for yourself," Lawrence shouted from somewhere behind her. Ignoring him, Ellie ducked under a metal railing and darted into a construction site. The skeletal frame of an unfinished building loomed over her, casting long shadows under the flickering streetlights. She hid behind a stack of wooden pallets, her chest heaving as she struggled to stay quiet. From her hiding spot, she could see Lawrence scanning the area, his phone in hand. "Find her," he barked into the device. "She's got the vial." Ellie's stomach sank. She realized Lawrence wasn't working alone. If she didn't move fast, she'd be cornered. Meanwhile, at the hospital, at St. Mary's Medical Center, Robert stirred in his bed, his memory gradually returning. His hand instinctively went to his chest as he recalled the searing pain that had overwhelmed him during dinner. A nurse entered, startled to see him awake. "Mr. King, it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Robert muttered, his voice raspy. The nurse smiled sympathetically. "You gave everyone quite a scare. The doctors say it was a poisoning, but they acted quickly enough to save you." Robert's brow furrowed as fragmented memories surfaced. He remembered the girl, her frantic voice warning him not to eat. "There was a girl," he said, struggling to sit up. At the restaurant, she knew something was wrong. The nurse hesitated. "The police brought in a girl for questioning, but she's not here anymore. They didn't have enough to hold her." Robert's heart sank. That girl had risked everything to warn him, and he hadn't even listened. He needed to find her. "Can you call my assistant?" he asked. "I need to get to the bottom of this." A narrow escape. Back at the construction site, Ellie crept through the shadows, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and damp concrete. She spotted a narrow gap in the perimeter fence and made a break for it, her small frame slipping through easily. The bright lights of the city greeted her as she emerged onto a crowded street. She blended into the throng of people, her head low, and kept moving until she reached an abandoned lot she often used as a refuge. Collapsing onto the cold ground, she clutched the vial in her hands, her thoughts a whirlwind. "What do I do now?" she whispered. She knew she couldn't go back to the police. They wouldn't take her seriously. She needed someone with power, someone who could stand up to Victoria. Her mind drifted to Robert. He was the only one who might listen. But how could she reach him? Victoria's next move. Inside the King mansion, Victoria paced the grand living room, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Lawrence stood nearby, his composure cracking under her icy glare. "You lost her," she snapped. "She's just a kid," Lawrence replied defensively. "She won't get far." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "That kid has the only thing tying me to the poisoning. Find her, Lawrence. If you can't handle this, I'll find someone who can." Lawrence nodded curtly, leaving the room with his phone pressed to his ear. Victoria sank into a velvet armchair, her lips curling into a smile as she poured herself a glass of red wine. "Enjoy your little victory, girl. It won't last." A glimmer of hope. The next morning, Ellie lingered near the hospital, her nerves on edge. She had spent the night debating whether to approach Robert, but her options were running out. She slipped through the side entrance and made her way to the floor, where she'd overheard staff mention Robert's room. Peeking through the door, she saw him sitting upright, speaking with a man in a suit. "I need to find her," Robert was saying. "She's the only one who knows what happened." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, someone believed her. Gathering her courage, she stepped into the room. "I'm here," she said softly. Robert turned, his expression a mix of relief and surprise. "It's you, the girl from the restaurant." Ellie nodded, clutching the vial in her hand. I have proof. She tried to kill you. Robert's eyes widened as she held out the vial. For the first time, he saw the fear and determination in her eyes. You're safe now, he said gently. We'll figure this out together. Outside the hospital, Lawrence sat in a sleek black car, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He watched as Ellie and Robert emerged, deep in conversation. So, she found him, he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He dialed Victoria's number. We have a problem, he said. Victoria's cold laughter echoed through the phone. Then fix it, whatever it takes. As the call ended, Lawrence stepped out of the car, his eyes narrowing on Robert and Ellie. This isn't over, he murmured as the screen faded to black. The hum of the hospital's air conditioning filled the quiet room as Ellie and Robert sat across from each other, a fragile alliance beginning to form. Ellie clutched the vial in her hands, holding it like a lifeline. Robert studied her with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The girl had risked everything to warn him, and now she had come back with proof. You're braver than most people I know, Robert said, his voice still weak from the poisoning. Ellie looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the vial. I didn't do it to be brave. I couldn't stand there and watch her hurt you, but I don't know what to do now. Nobody believes me. Robert nodded, his expression grim. They'll believe me, he said. We'll take this to the police together. With this evidence, they can't ignore it. But as Robert spoke, Ellie's eyes darted toward the window. Her instincts, honed from years of survival on the streets, whispered that they weren't safe. Outside, parked across the street, a sleek black car with tinted windows idled. A figure inside seemed to be watching. We have to leave, Ellie said suddenly, her voice urgent. Robert frowned. What are you talking about? Ellie gestured to the window. There's someone out there. They've been following me since last night. If they know I'm here, they'll come after you too. Robert followed her gaze, his jaw tightening as he caught a glimpse of the car. Victoria, he muttered under his breath. Victoria's orders. At the King Mansion, Victoria sat in her study, a crystal glass of wine in her hand. The room was a blend of opulence and icy precision. Leather-bound books lined the shelves, and a large portrait of her and Robert hung over the fireplace. Lawrence entered, his face grim. They're together, he said. The girl brought him the vial. Victoria's hand tightened around the glass, but her expression remained calm. And you let them? She asked, her voice as cold as the room's decor. We couldn't move in a public place like the hospital, Lawrence replied. But I have men watching them. Victoria's lips curved into a smile, but her eyes were devoid of warmth. Good. If they try to take this to the police, stop them. I don't care how. And Lawrence, she leaned forward, her tone venomous. Make sure that girl disappears this time. I don't care what it takes. Lawrence hesitated, knowing exactly what she was implying, but he nodded. Consider it done. The escape. Robert and Ellie didn't waste time. With Robert still recovering, Ellie had to help him as they slipped out of the hospital through a side exit. Every shadow seemed to hold danger, every passing car a potential threat. Ellie led Robert through a maze of alleys and back streets, her small frame moving with practiced ease while Robert struggled to keep up. His tailored suit was out of place in the grimy surroundings, but Ellie didn't care. We can't stay in one place for long, she whispered as they stopped to catch their breath behind a dumpster. Robert leaned against the wall, his breath labored. Where are we going? Ellie thought for a moment. She had no real plan, only the instinct to keep moving. Somewhere safe, she said finally. But before they could move again, the screech of tires echoed nearby. A black SUV turned into the alley, its headlights casting long shadows. Run, Ellie shouted, grabbing Robert's arm. The two sprinted down the alley, the SUV revving behind them. Men in dark suits spilled out, their footsteps echoing like thunder. Ellie ducked into a side street, pulling Robert with her. A narrow escape. The chase ended when Ellie led Robert to an abandoned warehouse. They slipped inside, their breaths ragged as they pressed themselves against the cold, rusted walls. Outside, they could hear the faint voices of the men searching for them. "This is insane," Robert whispered. "Victoria's actually sending people after us." Ellie nodded, peeking through a crack in the wall. "She doesn't want us talking to the police. That's how you know we're close to the truth." Robert looked at her, admiration and guilt warring in his expression. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," he said. "You're just a kid." Ellie glared at him. "Don't say that. Being a kid doesn't mean I don't know how to survive." Robert's shoulders sagged. He realized how much Ellie had endured just to get this far. "We'll survive this too," he said. "The police visit." Meanwhile, Victoria made her own move. She arrived at the LAPD precinct, her face the picture of concern. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge of my husband's poisoning case," she told the desk sergeant. Detective Daniels appeared a few moments later, surprised to see her. "Mrs. King, I didn't expect you here." Victoria gave a small, calculated smile. "I wanted to make sure everything is being done to catch the person responsible. My husband is still recovering, and it's been such a difficult time for us." Daniels nodded, his expression softening. "We're doing everything we can, ma'am. We don't have much to go on yet, but we'll get to the bottom of it." Victoria's smile widened. "I trust you will, and if there's anything I can do to help." She placed her hand lightly on Daniel's arm, her charm working its magic. Daniels nodded again, completely unaware of her true intentions. Ellie's revelation. Back at the warehouse, Ellie and Robert shared a quiet moment. Ellie pulled out the vial, holding it up to the dim light filtering through the broken windows. "This is it," she said. "This proves everything." Robert studied the vial, his expression serious. "We need to get this analyzed. If we can confirm what's in it, Victoria won't be able to deny anything." Ellie hesitated. "And what if she tries to cover it up? She's got money, power. She can make this all disappear." Robert placed a hand on her shoulder. "Not if we stay one step ahead. We need to be smart about this. I know someone who can help." Ellie nodded, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. "Okay, but we can't trust anyone. Not until we're sure." Outside the warehouse, Lawrence stood with two men in dark suits. He held a tracking device in his hand, its blinking light signaling their target's location. "They're inside," one of the men said. Lawrence's lips curled into a grim smile. "We've got them." The camera lingers on the warehouse as the men begin to surround it, the tension building. Inside, Ellie and Robert remain unaware of the danger closing in. Ellie clutches the vial tightly as Robert makes a call to his trusted contact. "We have the proof," he says into the phone, "but we're running out of time." As the screen fades to black, the faint sound of footsteps echoes outside, teasing the impending confrontation. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, growing louder with each passing second. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind a rusted metal crate. Beside her, Robert whispered urgently into his phone. "We're in a warehouse on East River Street," he said to the person on the other end. "We need immediate help, and bring someone who can analyze evidence. There's no time to waste." Ellie clutched the vial in her hand, the cool glass a sharp contrast to the heat building in her palms. She could feel the danger closing in around them. "They're here," she hissed, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Robert ended the call, tucking the phone into his jacket. "Help is coming," he assured her, though his voice trembled slightly. The confidence in his words didn't reach Ellie. She'd lived her entire life trusting no one, and tonight was no different. The hunters close in. Outside, Lawrence motioned for his men to move silently. They split into pairs, circling the warehouse like wolves stalking their prey. Lawrence held a tracking device in his hand, the blinking red signaling Ellie's location. "We don't let them leave with that vial," he ordered through gritted teeth. "Do whatever it takes." The men nodded, their expressions grim. One pulled a crowbar from his bag, using it to force open a side door. The creak of the rusted hinges echoed loudly in the night, sending a shiver through the silent air. Inside, Ellie's instincts flared. "They're coming," she whispered, grabbing Robert's arm. A desperate plan. Ellie led Robert deeper into the warehouse, weaving through stacks of wooden pallets and old machinery. They stopped behind a towering pile of metal beams, their shadows blending with the surrounding darkness. "We can't just wait for them to find us," Ellie said, her voice low but firm. Robert nodded, his breathing labored. "Do you have a plan?" Ellie's mind raced. She glanced around, her sharp eyes taking in their surroundings. "There's an emergency exit on the far side of the building," she said. "We'll make a break for it, but we have to be careful. If they catch us..." She didn't finish the sentence. Robert didn't need her to. "The chase begins." Ellie peeked around the corner of the metal beams, spotting two of Lawrence's men searching the warehouse. The glow of their flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams flickering over the walls like searching eyes. "Now," she whispered, tugging Robert's sleeve. The two crept through the maze of crates and machinery, their movements quiet and deliberate. Every step felt like an eternity, the sound of their own breathing deafening in the silence. Suddenly, one of the men's flashlights swung in their direction. Ellie froze, her hand gripping Robert's arm tightly. "Did you hear that?" one of the men asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Ellie motioned for Robert to stay low as the two men approached. Her mind raced. If they were spotted now, it would be over. A dangerous diversion. Thinking quickly, Ellie reached for a small metal wrench lying on the ground nearby. She hurled it into the shadows behind the men, the clang of metal against concrete echoing loudly. "Over there!" one of the men shouted, spinning toward the noise. As the men rushed toward the distraction, Ellie and Robert took their chance. They moved swiftly, darting through the shadows toward the emergency exit. The first confrontation. Just as they reached the exit, the door burst open. Lawrence stepped inside, his imposing figure framed by the dim light outside. He held a gun, the barrel glinting ominously in the faint moonlight. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. Ellie pushed Robert behind her, her small frame standing defiantly in front of him. "Leave us alone," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Lawrence chuckled, taking a step closer. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you now. Hand over the vial." Ellie tightened her grip on the glass, her knuckles white. "You can't have it," she said. Lawrence's expression hardened. "I wasn't asking." Robert, who had been silent, stepped forward. "You think this is going to end well for you?" he said, his voice low and steady. "You're working for Victoria, but she'll throw you under the bus the second this goes wrong. You know that." Lawrence hesitated for a brief moment, the crack in his confidence barely perceptible. "You're bluffing," Lawrence said, though his grip on the gun faltered slightly. "Am I?" Robert pressed. "You've seen how she operates. Do you really think she'll let you walk away from this clean?" Ellie watched as Lawrence's resolve wavered. She saw an opportunity and took it. Ellie's escape. Without warning, Ellie hurled the vial toward the ground. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, and a faint, acrid smell wafted up from the liquid seeping into the concrete. "No!" Lawrence shouted, lunging forward. In the chaos, Ellie grabbed Robert's hand and yanked him toward the open door. They ran as fast as they could, the sound of Lawrence's curses echoing behind them. The hidden ally. As Ellie and Robert emerged onto the dark street, a black sedan screeched to a halt in front of them. The driver's side door opened, revealing a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and an air of authority. "Get in," she shouted. Ellie hesitated, but Robert recognized her immediately. "Rebecca, you came," he said, relief flooding his voice. Rebecca, a private investigator Robert had hired years ago for another case, nodded curtly. "We don't have time. Move." Ellie and Robert climbed into the car just as Lawrence and his men burst out of the warehouse. "Follow them," Lawrence barked, and another black SUV roared to life, tires screeching as it gave chase. A deadly pursuit. The sedan sped through the darkened streets, Rebecca expertly weaving through traffic as the SUV gained on them. "Who's this?" Ellie asked, clutching the armrest. "Someone we can trust," Robert replied. "Rebecca's helped me before. She'll get us out of this." Rebecca glanced in the rearview mirror, her sharp eyes assessing the situation. "You picked a hell of a time to call, Robert," she said. "But don't worry, I've got this." The chase intensified, the SUV ramming the sedan's rear bumper. Ellie clutched the seat, her heart in her throat. "They're not giving up," she said, panic creeping into her voice. Rebecca's lips curled into a determined smile. "Neither am I." She swerved sharply, leading the SUV down a narrow alley. At the last second, she veered into a hidden side street, leaving the pursuing vehicle to overshoot and crash into a stack of pallets. A moment of respite. The sedan came to a screeching halt in an abandoned parking lot. Rebecca turned to Robert and Ellie, her expression serious. "We don't have much time," she said. "If you want to take Victoria down, we need more than just a broken vial." Ellie's face fell. "That was our only proof." Rebecca shook her head. "Proof can be recreated, but we need to move fast. Victoria won't stop until she's silenced both of you." As the group strategized, the camera panned to Victoria, standing on the balcony of her mansion. She held her phone to her ear, her voice calm but deadly. "They've escaped for now, but they won't get far," she said. "Make sure it's finished this time." The camera lingered on her cold smile before fading to black, leaving viewers eager to see how Ellie and Robert would fight back. The first light of dawn barely broke through the thick fog blanketing the city as Rebecca's sedan rolled into the shadowy recesses of an old parking garage. Ellie and Robert sat silently in the back seat, their breaths shallow and their nerves frayed. The events of the previous night still clung to them like a second skin. The shattering of the vial, the relentless chase, and Lawrence's cold, predatory eyes. Rebecca cut the engine and turned to face them. "We're safe for now," she said, her tone clipped but reassuring. "This garage belongs to an old client of mine. No one will think to look here, but we need to act fast. Victoria won't let this go." Ellie leaned forward, her small hands gripping the back of Rebecca's seat. "You keep saying that, but how are we supposed to fight her? We lost the only proof we had." Rebecca's sharp eyes softened slightly as she looked at Ellie. "Proof can be rebuilt, kid. We just need to be smarter about how we gather it." She turned to Robert. "You said you recognized what was in that vial, right?" Robert nodded, though his expression was tense. "It's a synthetic toxin, custom-made, expensive, and hard to trace. I've seen it in medical trials before. If we can find someone to analyze even the smallest trace, we'll have something to use against her." Ellie sank back into her seat, her arms crossed. "And how do we get something analyzed without Victoria's people showing up to finish us off?" Rebecca smirked. "That's where I come in. I know someone who can handle this." Discreetly. Victoria's next move, at the King Mansion. Victoria paced her opulent study, her frustration barely hidden beneath a veneer of calm. Lawrence stood at the doorway, his stance rigid. "You failed me," Victoria said coldly, her sharp heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, but kept his expression neutral. "They were more resourceful than expected, but we'll find them. It's only a matter of time." Victoria turned to face him, her gaze piercing. "Time isn't on our side, Lawrence. Robert is alive, and that street rat is with him. She's already proven to be a bigger nuisance than I anticipated. This ends now." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I want you to use every resource we have. Bring them both to me, alive or otherwise. And if anyone else gets in your way," she paused, her meaning clear. Lawrence nodded, the weight of her words heavy in the air. Understood. As he left, Victoria moved to her desk, picking up a framed photo of her and Robert. Her manicured fingers traced the edges of his face. "You should have stayed oblivious, darling," she murmured. "Now I have to clean up this mess myself." A new lead. Back in the parking garage, Rebecca pulled a laptop from the trunk of her car, setting it up on the hood. The glow from the screen illuminated her determined face as she typed quickly, accessing encrypted files. "What are you doing?" Ellie asked, curiosity piqued. "Searching," Rebecca replied. Victoria didn't get this powerful without leaving a digital footprint. People like her always think they're untouchable, but they always leave breadcrumbs. We just have to find them. Robert stepped closer, peering at the screen. "Do you think she's been using the company's resources for this? If she has, there might be records in the financial files." Rebecca smirked. "Exactly. If she's funding shady deals, toxins, or hitmen, it'll show up somewhere." Ellie, though intrigued, couldn't shake her unease. "And what happens when Victoria realizes we're digging into her files? Won't that make things worse?" Rebecca's fingers paused on the keyboard for a moment before she turned to Ellie. "It's already bad, but the difference is now we're fighting back." The trail of deceit. As Rebecca dug deeper into the files, she uncovered a hidden account tied to Victoria. The transactions were large, frequent, and pointed toward a shell corporation based overseas. "This is it," Rebecca said, her voice triumphant. "She's been funneling money to a biotech firm. Guess what their specialty is?" Robert leaned closer, his jaw tightening. "Toxins." Rebecca nodded. "Bingo. And if we can tie this to the vial, we'll have enough to bring her down." Ellie frowned. "But the vial's gone." Rebecca gave her a sharp look. "Maybe the physical vial is gone, but we know where it came from. And I'm willing to bet this biotech firm has records." The hidden laboratory. The trio wasted no time. Rebecca made a call to her contact, a former forensic scientist named Dr. Simon Greaves. Within hours, they were on their way to his remote lab on the outskirts of the city. The lab was hidden in an unassuming industrial complex, its windows darkened and its entrance marked only by a small plaque. Dr. Greaves, a wiry man with keen eyes, greeted them at the door. "Rebecca," he said, his voice tinged with both surprise and caution. "It's been a while. You sure know how to pick your emergencies." Rebecca smirked. "Good to see you too, Simon. We need your help, and we need it fast." She handed him the data sheet uncovered, along with a detailed explanation of the toxin. Dr. Greaves raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll see what I can do, but if this is as big as it sounds, you're playing a dangerous game." The trap is set. As Dr. Greaves worked, the trio waited in the dimly lit lab. Ellie paced nervously, her sharp eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. "I don't like sitting here," she said. "It feels like we're waiting to be caught." Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes you have to take risks to win." But Ellie's instincts were screaming, and soon her fears were validated. The faint sound of approaching vehicles reached their ears, growing louder by the second. Rebecca cursed under her breath, peering out a small window. "Victoria's goons. They found us." Dr. Greaves appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "I don't know what you've gotten yourselves into, but I just found something big. The toxin. It's experimental and linked directly to Victoria's biotech firm. There's no way she can deny this." "Great," Rebecca said, her voice heavy with sarcasm. "Now we just have to stay alive long enough to use it." The final standoff. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway as Lawrence and his men stormed the building. Rebecca pulled a small handgun from her jacket, motioning for the others to stay low. "Simon, is there a back way out?" she asked. Dr. Greaves shook his head. "No, this place was built for security, not escape." Ellie's mind raced as she scanned the lab. Her eyes landed on a set of heavy shelves filled with equipment. "We can block the door," she said. "Working together." They pushed the shelves against the door just as the first thud of a battering ram shook the frame. "This won't hold them for long," Robert said, his voice grim. Rebecca nodded. "Then we need to fight. Ellie, stay behind cover. Robert, you and Simon work on securing the data. I'll hold them off." The cliffhanger. As the battering ram broke through, Rebecca fired a warning shot, forcing the men to retreat momentarily. She turned to Ellie, her face set with determination. "Kid, this is where it gets real. Are you ready?" Ellie nodded, clutching a wrench she grabbed from the lab bench. "I've been ready my whole life." The door burst open, and the screen faded to black as chaos erupted, leaving viewers desperate to see who would emerge victorious. The lab exploded into chaos as Lawrence's men charged through the shattered door. Rebecca fired a precise shot, forcing them to take cover behind overturned tables and filing cabinets. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces, creating a cacophony of sound that rattled Ellie to her core. "Stay down," Rebecca shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Ellie crouched behind a metal bench, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched the wrench in her trembling hands, her knuckles white against the cold steel. Beside her, Robert frantically worked on transferring Dr. Greaves' data onto a secure drive. "How much longer, Robert?" Rebecca called out, her voice tight with urgency. "A few more minutes," he yelled back, sweat beading on his forehead. Lawrence's ruthless advance. Behind the line of overturned tables, Lawrence barked orders to his men. His face was a mask of fury, his usual calm replaced by a barely contained rage. "Push forward. I want them alive." His men obeyed, firing suppressive shots to pin Rebecca down. One of them lobbed a smoke grenade into the lab, the hissing canister releasing a thick cloud that quickly engulfed the room. Ellie coughed, her vision blurring as the acrid smoke filled her lungs. "I can't see," she gasped, her voice tinged with panic. Rebecca grabbed her arm, pulling her further behind cover. "Focus. Use your ears," she commanded. Ellie closed her eyes, forcing herself to listen. The sound of footsteps on the tiled floor grew louder, closing in on their position. A sudden explosion. Dr. Greaves, who had been working frantically at another terminal, suddenly shouted, "They're overriding the security system. I can't keep them out much longer." Rebecca's eyes darted to the thick steel door at the back of the lab. "Is there a way to seal that door manually?" Dr. Greaves nodded, his hands shaking as he pointed to a control panel. "Yes, but someone has to activate it from the outside." Rebecca cursed under her breath, weighing their dwindling options. Before she could decide, a deafening explosion rocked the lab. The blast sent Ellie sprawling to the floor, her ears ringing and her vision spinning. When the smoke cleared, she saw Lawrence standing in the doorway, his gun aimed directly at Robert. "Game over," Lawrence said, his voice cold and final. Ellie finds her strength. As Lawrence stepped forward, Rebecca moved to intercept him, her weapon raised. But Ellie, driven by a surge of adrenaline, acted first. Gripping the wrench tightly, she launched herself at Lawrence, swinging with all her strength. The wrench connected with his forearm, forcing him to drop his gun with a grunt of pain. Lawrence's men turned their weapons on Ellie, but Rebecca fired a series of rapid shots, forcing them to retreat momentarily. "Get back!" Rebecca shouted, her voice fierce. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her breathing ragged. Lawrence glared at her, his expression a mix of anger and grudging respect. "You've got guts, kid," he said, nursing his injured arm. "But guts won't save you." The ticking clock. Meanwhile, Robert's fingers flew across the keyboard as he copied the last of the data onto the drive. "Got it," he shouted, holding up the drive triumphantly. Rebecca turned to him, her face lit with relief. "Good. Now we just have to get out of here alive." But their victory was short-lived. More of Lawrence's men poured into the lab, their sheer numbers overwhelming Rebecca's ability to hold them off. Dr. Greaves ducked under a table, clutching a folder filled with critical documents. "There's a ventilation shaft in the corner," he called out, pointing to a grate near the ceiling. "It leads outside." Rebecca's gaze snapped to the shaft, and she nodded. "That's our way out. Ellie, you go first." The narrow escape. Ellie hesitated, looking at Rebecca with wide eyes. "What about you?" Rebecca shoved her toward the shaft, her tone brooking no argument. "I'll cover you. Go!" Reluctantly, Ellie climbed onto the table and pulled herself into the shaft. The narrow space was suffocating, but she pushed forward, her determination outweighing her fear. Behind her, Robert handed the drive to Dr. Greaves before following Ellie into the shaft. Rebecca fired one last round before retreating, her movements quick and efficient. "Hurry up," Rebecca urged as she climbed in after them. Lawrence's men reached the shaft just as Rebecca yanked the grate closed. She slammed a nearby lever, activating an emergency lock that sealed the shaft from the inside. "That'll hold them for a while," she muttered, crawling forward. Victoria's cold fury. At the King Mansion, Victoria stood in her private study, watching the chaos unfold on a live security feed. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in her posture betrayed her anger. A voice crackled through her phone. "They got away," Lawrence reported, his tone laced with frustration. "But we damaged their operation. They can't run forever." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. "Damaged isn't good enough, Lawrence. I don't pay you to leave loose ends. We'll find them," Lawrence promised. "It's only a matter of time." Victoria ended the call without responding, her mind already racing with her next move. She turned to her assistant, who stood nervously by the door. "Double the bounty. I want them found before they have a chance to use what they stole." The assistant nodded quickly, retreating from the room. Victoria walked to her desk, where a framed photo of Robert sat. She picked it up, her fingers tracing his face. "You should have stayed quiet, darling. Now you force my hand." A safe haven, for now. Ellie, Robert, Rebecca, and Dr. Greaves emerged from the ventilation shaft into a quiet alley several blocks from the lab. The cool night air hit them like a wave, and they paused to catch their breath. "Is everyone okay?" Rebecca asked, scanning their faces. Ellie nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "We made it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Greaves held up the drive, his expression grim. "We have the data, but they won't stop coming after us. Victoria has too much to lose." Rebecca nodded, her jaw set. "Then we need to go on the offensive. If we keep running, she'll pick us off one by one. It's time to expose her." A plan takes shape. Back at a safe house Rebecca had prepared, the group huddled around a table covered in maps and documents. Dr. Greaves connected the drive to a laptop, pulling up the stolen data. "This is enough to destroy her," he said, scrolling through the files. "Financial records, lab reports, emails, it's all here." Ellie leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "So, what do we do with it? Send it to the police." Rebecca shook her head. "Victoria has too much influence. If we hand this over now, she'll bury it before anyone even sees it." "Then what?" Robert asked. Rebecca's eyes gleamed with determination. "We make it public. All of it. The world needs to see who she really is." The cliffhanger. As the group finalized their plan, the camera shifted to a dark corner of the city. Lawrence stood in the shadows, his phone pressed to his ear. "They're regrouping," he said, "and they have the data." Victoria's voice was cold and calculating. "Then burn their safe house to the ground. If they want a war, I'll give them one." The scene cut to black as flames began to flicker in the distance, leaving viewers desperate to know how the group would survive Victoria's next move. The flames crept hungrily along the edges of the old warehouse that served as the group's safe house. The acrid stench of smoke filled the air as the fire spread with unnerving speed, licking at the cracked walls and rusting beams. Inside, Rebecca, Ellie, Robert, and Dr. Greaves were deep in planning when the first explosion rocked the building. "What the hell was that?" Rebecca barked, bolting to her feet. Before anyone could respond, the second explosion shook the floor, sending a shower of debris raining down. Smoke began to seep under the door, thick and suffocating. Ellie grabbed Rebecca's arm, her voice trembling. "Is it them? Are they here?" Rebecca's sharp eyes darted to the windows, now glowing orange. "It's not just them. They're trying to burn us alive." Robert rushed to the laptop, fumbling to disconnect the drive containing the evidence. "We can't leave this behind," he shouted over the sound of splintering wood. Rebecca pulled him back, her voice firm. "Forget the drive. We need to get out of here now." The inferno. The fire spread faster than any of them expected, fueled by accelerants strategically placed around the warehouse. Smoke filled the room, burning their lungs and blurring their vision. "Over here," Dr. Greaves yelled, pointing to a back exit. They stumbled toward the door, coughing and shielding their faces from the heat. But when Rebecca wrenched it open, she froze. Standing in the alley was Lawrence, flanked by two armed men. "Going somewhere?" he sneered, raising his gun. Rebecca slammed the door shut, her mind racing. "They've blocked the exits," she muttered. "We're trapped." Ellie's eyes darted around the room, landing on a rusted ladder leading to a skylight. "Up there," she shouted. Rebecca followed her gaze, nodding. "It's our best shot. Move!" A perilous climb. The group scrambled up the ladder, the metal groaning under their weight. Flames licked at the edges of the room, growing hotter by the second. Ellie climbed first, her hands slick with sweat as she pushed open the skylight. The cool night air hit her face like a blessing. "Hurry!" she called down, reaching to help Robert through the opening. Rebecca and Dr. Greaves followed, their movements hurried but precise. As Rebecca hauled herself onto the roof, a loud crack echoed through the warehouse. The ladder gave way, crashing into the flames below. "We made it," Ellie whispered, her chest heaving. But Rebecca shook her head, her gaze fixed on the alley below. Not yet. A deadly ambush. From their vantage point, they could see Lawrence's men circling the building, their weapons ready. One of them spoke into a radio, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "The fire's almost got them. Be ready to take them out if they try to run." Rebecca pulled Ellie down, keeping her out of sight. "They're waiting for us to make a move," she said grimly. "We need a distraction." Dr. Greaves adjusted his glasses, his face pale but determined. "There's a water tower on the next building. If we can get to it, we might be able to create enough of a diversion to slip past them." Rebecca glanced at the gap between the two rooftops, her jaw tightening. "That's a long jump." Ellie's stomach turned as she looked at the narrow but terrifying gap. "What if we fall?" Rebecca placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we don't. Let's go." The leap of faith. One by one, they lined up at the edge of the roof. Rebecca went first, her movements precise and confident. She landed with a grunt on the adjacent building, rolling to absorb the impact. "Come on," she called, motioning for the others to follow. Ellie hesitated, her legs shaking, but Robert's voice steadied her. "You can do this, Ellie. Just don't look down." Taking a deep breath, Ellie ran and jumped, her arms flailing as she landed hard on the other side. Rebecca grabbed her just before she slipped, pulling her to safety. Robert and Dr. Greaves followed, both barely making it across. The moment they regrouped, Rebecca led them to the water tower. "Dr. Greaves, think you can figure out how to flood the alley?" she asked. He nodded, already climbing up to inspect the tank. "Give me a minute." Lawrence closes in. Below, Lawrence grew impatient. The fire had consumed most of the building, and there was no sign of the group. "They're not getting out of this alive," he muttered, signaling his men to move closer. But as they approached the building, a loud groan echoed from above. The water tower creaked ominously before bursting, releasing a torrent of water that cascaded down the alley. The flood caught Lawrence's men off guard, knocking them off their feet and scattering their weapons. Rebecca smirked from the rooftop. "That'll slow them down. Let's go." The chase resumes. The group climbed down the far side of the building, using a fire escape to reach the street. The cold night air was a stark contrast to the blazing inferno they'd just escaped. "Where now?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Rebecca scanned the area, her mind racing. "We need to split up. They'll expect us to stick together." Ellie's eyes widened. "Split up? Are you serious?" Rebecca crouched in front of her, her tone firm but kind. "It's the only way. We'll meet back at the diner where we first talked, 2 hours from now." "Got it." Ellie nodded reluctantly, her grip tightening on the wrench she still carried. Victoria's fury. Back at the King Mansion, Victoria watched the fire on a live feed, her fingers drumming impatiently on her desk. "Lawrence, report," she demanded, her voice icy. Lawrence's voice crackled through the speaker. "They escaped, but we're tracking them." Victoria's expression darkened. "You promised me results, Lawrence. I don't tolerate failure." "I'll handle it," Lawrence replied, though his tone betrayed his frustration. Victoria ended the call, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down. She turned to her assistant. "Double the bounty. I want every resource at our disposal hunting them." A new ally, Rebecca, Ellie, Robert, and Dr. Greaves successfully regrouped at the diner. Exhausted but alive, Rebecca pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her jacket and slid it across the table to Robert. "This is the address of someone who can help us. He used to work for Victoria, but turned on her when he realized what she was capable of. If anyone has the leverage we need to expose her, it's him." Robert unfolded the paper, reading the name aloud. "Marcus Lane." Dr. Greaves frowned. "You think we can trust him?" Rebecca shrugged. "We don't have a choice. He's our best shot." The cliffhanger. As the group prepared to leave, the bell above the diner's door jingled. A man in a dark coat stepped inside, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He scanned the room before locking eyes with Rebecca. "Rebecca Monroe," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I believe you're looking for me." The screen faded to black as Marcus Lane slid into the booth across from them, leaving viewers eager to learn whether he would be their salvation or their doom. The diner's neon sign buzzed softly, casting a flickering red glow over the cracked vinyl booths. Marcus Lane slid into the seat across from Rebecca, his movements calm but deliberate. He set a leather-bound notebook on the table, his eyes scanning the group with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "So, you're the ones causing Victoria all this trouble," Marcus said, his voice low and gravelly. Rebecca leaned forward, her arms crossed. "We didn't bring you here for introductions. Are you going to help us or not?" Marcus smirked, the faintest glimmer of amusement crossing his weathered face. "That depends. Do you have what you promised?" Robert pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and set it on the table, sliding it toward Marcus. "This has everything. Financial records, experiments, proof of what Victoria's been doing." Marcus picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. "Impressive. But this isn't just about proof. Victoria has allies, powerful ones. Exposing her won't be enough unless we can ensure her downfall is absolute." Rebecca's gaze hardened. "That's why we need you. You know her system, her vulnerabilities. We can't take her down without you. A hidden agenda." Marcus sat back, his eyes narrowing. "You're right about that. But working with me comes with risks. If Victoria gets wind that I'm helping you, she'll send her entire army after us." Ellie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze flicking nervously to the window. "She already is," Ellie murmured, her voice barely audible. Marcus studied her, his expression softening for a moment. "You're the girl they're talking about on the news. The street kid turned whistleblower. You're braver than most adults I know." Ellie swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Rebecca jumped in, steering the conversation back on track. "We don't have time for speeches. Are you in or not?" Marcus smirked again, though this time it seemed genuine. I'm in, but we'll have to move quickly. There's a storm coming, and we're running out of time. Planning the attack. In a dingy motel room miles away, the group huddled around a table strewn with maps, documents, and Marcus's notebook. He opened it, revealing sketches of Victoria's main headquarters, a sleek skyscraper in the heart of the city. This is where she operates from, Marcus explained, pointing to a blueprint. The top floors are her personal office and lab. That's where the evidence she's hidden will be. Robert frowned, studying the diagram. It's a fortress. How are we supposed to get in there? Marcus tapped a spot on the blueprint. The ventilation system. It's how she smuggles certain contraband in and out. It's heavily monitored, but it's our best shot. Rebecca nodded, already forming a plan. We'll split into 2 teams. Marcus, you and Robert will handle disabling the security system. Ellie and I will head for the lab to recover the evidence. Ellie's eyes widened. Me? Why me? Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Because you've proven you can handle yourself, and I need someone I trust by my side. Ellie nodded hesitantly, her determination outweighing her fear. Okay, I'll do it. Victoria tightens the net. Meanwhile, Victoria paced her office, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor. Lawrence stood near the window, his arm in a sling from the injury Ellie had inflicted during their last encounter. They've connected with Marcus, Lawrence reported, his voice tight with frustration. Victoria's lips curled into a snarl. Of course they have. That traitor always did have a soft spot for lost causes. Lawrence hesitated before speaking again. Should we bring him in? He might still be persuaded to switch sides. Victoria shook her head. No, he's already made his choice. Kill him, and everyone he's protecting. Lawrence nodded grimly, reaching for his radio. Understood. Victoria turned toward the window, her expression cold and calculating. This ends tonight. I want them erased permanently. A dangerous infiltration, under the cover of darkness. The group approached Victoria's skyscraper. Marcus led them to an access point for the ventilation system, his movements precise and practiced. This is it, he whispered. Once we're inside, we'll have to move fast. Rebecca nodded, gesturing for Robert and Marcus to take their positions. We'll meet you at the rendezvous point in 30 minutes. Don't be late. Ellie followed Rebecca into the vent, the metal creaking softly beneath their weight. The narrow space was suffocating, but they pressed on, their determination unwavering. You okay? Rebecca whispered. Ellie nodded, though her hands trembled. Yeah, let's keep going. Betrayal unveiled. As Marcus and Robert worked to disable the building's security system, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his expression darkening as he read the message. What is it? Robert asked, noticing Marcus's hesitation. Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. We've got a problem. Victoria knows we're here. Before Robert could respond, a loud crash echoed down the hall. A group of armed guards stormed into the room, their weapons raised. Hands up, one of them barked. Robert froze, his eyes darting to Marcus. What do we do now? Marcus raised his hand slowly, a resigned expression on his face. We stall. Rebecca and Ellie need time to finish the job. A heart-stopping discovery. In the lab, Ellie and Rebecca rifled through cabinets and computers, searching for the hidden evidence. Rebecca's sharp eyes caught sight of a locked drawer, and she motioned for Ellie to help. This has to be it, Rebecca said, prying it open with a crowbar. Inside was a hard drive labeled Project Dawn. Rebecca's breath hitched as she examined it. This is it. This is what we came for. Ellie stared at the drive, her mind racing. What's on it? Rebecca hesitated, her tone grave. Proof of everything. Experiments, bribes, murders. This is enough to bury Victoria forever. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them in place. Rebecca grabbed the drive, shoving it into her bag. "We've got company," she muttered. "The cliffhanger." As they prepared to make their escape, the lab door burst open, revealing Lawrence flanked by armed guards. He aimed his weapon at Rebecca, his eyes cold and calculating. "Going somewhere?" he sneered. Rebecca shoved Ellie behind her, her jaw set in defiance. "You won't stop us." Lawrence's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Oh, I think I will." The screen faded to black as a gunshot echoed through the lab, leaving viewers on the edge of their seats, desperate to know who survived and how the mission would end. The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the lab, reverberating off the sterile walls. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Rebecca lunged forward, shoving Ellie to the ground as Lawrence's bullet shattered the glass of a nearby computer monitor. "Run!" Rebecca shouted, her voice hoarse but commanding. Ellie scrambled to her feet, clutching Rebecca's bag tightly as Lawrence barked orders to his guards. "Don't let them escape." The lab erupted into chaos. Rebecca grabbed a metal pipe from a nearby table and swung it at the nearest guard, disarming him with a single blow. "Ellie, go! I'll cover you." The last stand. Ellie hesitated for a moment, her wide eyes darting between Rebecca and the guards closing in. "I'm not leaving you," she cried. Rebecca glared at her, her tone fierce. "This isn't up for debate. Go!" Ellie turned and bolted toward the exit, dodging a hail of bullets that whizzed past her. Rebecca stayed behind, her movements swift and precise as she fought off Lawrence and his men. She knew she couldn't win, but her goal wasn't victory. It was buying Ellie time, a desperate escape. Ellie burst into the hallway, her heart pounding. The hard drive in Rebecca's bag felt like a lead weight in her hands, a physical reminder of the stakes. She sprinted toward the nearest stairwell, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Focus," she muttered to herself. "You can do this." Behind her, the sound of gunfire grew louder. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of guards chasing her down the corridor. "They're not going to stop," she realized, her stomach churning with fear. She reached the stairwell and threw open the door, the metallic clang echoing through the space. As she descended the stairs two at a time, she clung to the hope that Rebecca would follow. Marcus's gamble. Elsewhere in the building, Marcus and Robert sat handcuffed to a radiator in a dark, damp maintenance room. The guards had left them under the assumption that they weren't a threat. "Great plan," Robert muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus shot him a withering look. "Do you want to get out of here or not?" Robert glared but nodded. "What's the plan?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "There's a knife in my boot. If I can reach it." Before he could finish, the door creaked open, revealing a lone guard. Marcus seized the opportunity, kicking the knife toward Robert while distracting the guard with a flurry of insults. "You think you're going to get away with this? Victoria doesn't even trust you." The guard stormed toward Marcus, silencing him with a punch. In the commotion, Robert retrieved the knife and began sawing at their restraints. "Hurry," Marcus hissed, spitting blood onto the floor. With one final tug, the cuff snapped free. Robert launched himself at the guard, taking him down with surprising force. Marcus grabbed the guard's weapon, nodding at Robert. "Nice work. Let's go find Rebecca and Ellie." Rebecca's sacrifice. Back in the lab, Rebecca was cornered. Her strength was fading, but she refused to give up. Lawrence stepped closer, his gun trained on her. "It's over, Rebecca," he said, his voice cold. "You should have stayed out of this." Rebecca smirked, blood trickling from a cut on her lip. "Funny, I was about to say the same to you." Before Lawrence could react, she kicked over a gas canister, sending it rolling toward him. He instinctively stepped back, giving Rebecca just enough time to grab a nearby fire extinguisher and hurl it at another guard. The impact sent the man sprawling, but Rebecca knew she was out of options. She turned and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind her. She jammed a metal chair under the handle, buying herself a few precious seconds to escape. The rooftop confrontation. Ellie burst onto the rooftop, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. She skidded to a stop, her eyes darting around for an escape route. The sound of footsteps behind her made her stomach drop. Rebecca emerged moments later, panting and battered but alive. "You made it," Ellie breathed, relief washing over her. Rebecca nodded, her eyes scanning the skyline. "We're not safe yet. Where's Marcus?" Before Ellie could answer, the rooftop door slammed open. Lawrence stepped through, his gun aimed squarely at them. "This ends now," he growled. Rebecca stepped in front of Ellie, her hands raised. "Let her go, Lawrence. This is between you and me." Lawrence sneered. "You think I care about her? She's just collateral damage." Marcus's redemption. A gunshot rang out, but it wasn't from Lawrence. Marcus appeared behind him, his weapon drawn. The bullet grazed Lawrence's arm, forcing him to drop his gun. "You!" Lawrence spat, clutching his arm. Marcus stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You made a mistake underestimating me." Rebecca took advantage of the distraction, kicking Lawrence's gun off the rooftop. He lunged at her, but Marcus and Rebecca subdued him together, pinning him to the ground. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice cold. "You've lost." The final blow. As sirens wailed in the distance, Rebecca turned to Ellie. "Go. Take the hard drive and get to the safe house. We'll meet you there." Ellie hesitated, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to leave you." Rebecca cupped Ellie's face, her expression softening. "You're the future, Ellie. Go. Make this count." With a reluctant nod, Ellie ran, disappearing into the shadows just as the police arrived. Justice served. Victoria sat in her opulent office, sipping a glass of wine as she watched the chaos unfold on her security monitors. Her confidence was shattered when the police stormed in moments later, arresting her on charges brought by the evidence Ellie had successfully delivered. "This isn't over," Victoria screamed as they dragged her away. But Rebecca, watching from a distance, knew it was a new beginning. Weeks later, Ellie and Rebecca stood on the rooftop of a new safe house, watching the sunrise. "What now?" Ellie asked. Rebecca smiled. Her bruises faded, but her determination stronger than ever. "Now we rebuild, together." As the sun bathed the city in golden light, Ellie held the hard drive tightly, knowing they had changed the world. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.